Welcome to This Week in Correctional Institutions. This week, we're going to look at the local correctional landscape and delve into jails and houses of corrections. By looking at the local correctional landscape, we will start to get an understanding of the importance of having these facilities within our communities, the purpose they serve, the population they serve, and the importance of having this type of alternative within our 21st century corrections. We'll break it down and talk about the history and development of the jail. We'll identify exactly what makes up the typical offender population within our jail. We'll talk about the structure and the administration within inside our jails. And then we're going to take a look at the architecture and what has changed over the course of 180 years in generation of jails and why the change has been important. We'll take a look at the types of programs that are available within jails and why that is going to be a challenge. And look at some of the legal and administrative issues that go along with this jail population. Last, we'll take a look at some of the future trends, now that we're in the 21st century, of being part of the local jail correctional landscape. And so with that, let's start with Chapter 5 in Correctional Institutions and talk about jails and houses of correction. When we look back and remember talking in Chapter 1, we talked about the history and where we got a lot of our correctional ideals, philosophies, goals. And one thing that you can recall is that one of the concepts that came out of our early history was that during the medieval period, which would encompass anywhere from 500 to about 1500, was the concept of the jail. And this was something that originally was used quite prominently in England, and it was an original place that people who were suspected of criminal offenses could be temporarily placed until they could be tried for crimes in their area against the crown, and they eventually kind of saw their purpose as morphing into not only one of temporary detention, but one of punishment for whatever offense they had been found guilty of. Once the exploration into the New World began, then we saw those principles and ideals and philosophies sort of follow those who came to the North American colonies. And the influence of the purpose behind those also transcended into the early American jails in the colonies. Some of the first colonial jails that were erected here you can find in places like Virginia, especially in Williamsburg, and the concept was extremely different than what it is today. Again, centering on what the original principle was back when the English shires were using them. They were nothing more than rooms, and therefore were only holding people for temporary times or for specific reasons, and therefore there was no separating them for any particular reason. So you had all the people in one room, and that presented its own sorts of problems. Virginia did establish the first colonial jail, but we remember the establishment of the Walnut Street Jail, which was mentioned also in the first lecture, that was going to be eventually what became our model. So let's take a look at the distinction between the two with a diagram of just what the Virginia model looked like when it was first put into existence in the early 1700s. As you can see by the diagram in the bottom, this is an actual blueprint of what the jail in Williamsburg looked like in 1703, 1704. If you were to go to Williamsburg today, it is a historical place that still is toured very heavily today, and you would see a pretty close replica of what the Williamsburg jail looked like. And as you can see with the arrows and the circle, the only real separation that they had was they tried to keep the criminals away from the debtors. And there was a distinction between the two, is you either committed crimes or you were kept in jail because you owed the counties a debt. You couldn't pay your bills to whoever you owed. And so they did try and keep those somewhat separate. You had a yard, but it was also encompassed within walls, so you weren't allowed really outside, but you were allowed access into a yard of some sort. But if you look, all of these access areas into yards did mean that all of the people within this large jail in Williamsburg did have access to each other. Now, the thing that I actually circled in the debtor's prison, but also was located in the south yard, is the toilet. And so each area had a toilet, but as you can see, it was one toilet that had to be shared by everybody that was in there. And so you can imagine, by looking just at this small diagram of the jail that was built in Williamsburg, it would have the tendency to be very non-sanitary, which led to health problems. If you had everybody living in one area, then what you had was the propensity for disease, for vermin, for assaults, and all of those types of things. So it wasn't a perfect idea, but it was the concept that they brought with them from England, where they had the concept with them when they first moved. Now, we talked previously in the other slide about the Pennsylvania jails. Now, back in the first lecture, we talked about the Walnut Street Jail, which came into inception back in the late 1700s. This became the model for what was the goal of a jail, which was to have the inhabitants, the offenders, work during the day to do hard labor, because the idea was for reformation. This was the first time that the philosophies of what a jail was supposed to accomplish had started to change. So you're talking of the span of less than 70 years of what the jail was supposed to accomplish, going from just a holding place until either a true punishment could be carried out, remembering that in the early 1700s, we were still relying very heavily on corporal or capital punishment, to a change in philosophy by a group of people who really believed that corporal and capital punishment were against a great law, and looking toward a way to reform the offenders by giving them discipline, hard labor, and finding a way to return them to the society better than they came in. And so Pennsylvania jails that started with the Walnut Street Jail back in the late 1700s initially were those for debtors, slaves, and the mentally and physically ill. Initially, and it started to evolve then to hold those similar to those in Williamsburg, but with a purpose. And eventually then they became the model that other states started to use as we grew into a country that centered on incarceration as a philosophy and not as a stopgap between the trial and the punishment. When we look at what our contemporary jails in the 21st century look like, they will typically look, depending on jurisdiction and geographic location, into probably 3 specific types of facilities. Now, first, let's take a look at a definition that you will need to know and become familiar with, and that is a jail. Now, remembering from your Introduction to Corrections class, a jail, for your review, is a facility that is authorized to hold pretrial detainees and sentenced misdemeanants for periods longer than 48 hours, but for less than a year. One of the things that makes a jail unique is that it is administered at the county level, typically by a sheriff, and we'll talk a little bit more about his role or her role in making sure that the jail functions and runs effectively and adequately within their jurisdiction. A lot of times, jails are detaining people who cannot make bail, can't afford bail. They are the intake centers or the jumping off point for those that are entering the criminal justice system. So think about it. You have law enforcement officers that make their arrests. If they don't have anywhere to place those people, then what are they going to do? Because without a jail to hold them, to put them through the court system, there would be no place to place the people that are being arrested. Whether it's for minor infractions or major serious crimes, you have to have a place where they can stay and enter the system to go through the adjudication process. That's what jails do. It also, unfortunately, especially in the United States, has become a place that is either a first place or a last resort for people who are not necessarily belonging in a jail, but we don't know where else to put them. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this lecture. But they belong really as part of a social service agency or a welfare agency, a public health agency. So we're talking about the maladjusted, displaced outliers in our agencies so often become part of our jail population. So we typically have 3 types of local corrections facilities that will be in our community depending again on jurisdiction, geographics, and administration. One is going to be the jail, we already have talked about. The second type is going to be a lockup. And the lockup is generally going to be in a metropolitan area or a police-run area that is going to be specifically temporary holdings for less than 48 hours. And if you have a metropolitan police department who has capabilities to hold arrestees for this period of time, their sole purpose is to get them processed and get them maybe in front of the judge, maybe get them sobered up enough to go in front of the judge prior to being transferred to the jail. The last type of contemporary jail that is local nowadays is what we call a workhouse, or a house of correction. And while not necessarily common here in the state of Michigan, it is still something that is common in the Northeast, because it was something that was conceived during the early colonial days when this type of concept was being used. And something that comes over again from the English concept of what to use. It holds convicted inmates sentenced to short terms. If you remember from our earlier lectures in like Introduction to Corrections, you remember that houses of corrections and workhouses were something that were conceived back in the 16th century, where they could place those petty and low-level criminals into these workhouses or houses of corrections to serve their sentences, to be placed to hard labor. So while maybe not the same concept from the 16th century, it is something that is still used for those misdemeanants who are sentenced to short terms and becomes kept separate from those in the jail that are there for pre-trial reasons only. New Hampshire and Massachusetts still make the distinction between the jail and houses of corrections, where the county jail holds pre-trial detainees. Houses of corrections in those jurisdictions are for those who are serving sentences on low-level misdemeanor charges. If you look at how our current breakdown in our jails are today, you'll find that we have many different types of jails throughout the United States. And that is based on the fact that we have many different types of counties, and if you're in Louisiana, parishes, that dictate what the jails in those areas are going to look like. All in all, across the United States, there are going to be about 35 to 3,600 jails that are operated on any given day across the United States. But when it comes to the size of those jails, that is going to depend a lot on the population of the county at the time. And believe it or not, of those 3,500 jails, most of them are very small. And by small, we mean 1 to 49 beds on an average daily basis. 1,500 of our jails across the United States are considered to be very small. The next size, at 1,300, are going to be small, with 50 to 249 beds. So 70% of the jails across the United States are between very small and small, with an average daily population of 1 to 249 beds. 500 jails across the United States have a population of anywhere from 250 to 900 beds. And only 200 jails across the United States have an average daily population of more than 1,000. But it's going to be those 200 that house the highest population across the United States. They're going to be the Rikers Islands, the Miami-Dades, the Philadelphias, the Chicago Cook counties, the Houstons, the LA counties. Those huge major metropolitan areas that have the largest county jails within the United States are part of that 200 that have an average daily population of 1,000 or more. The jails across the United States are extremely diverse, and therefore have a lot of challenges, and they vary from one jail to another. A jail that only houses up to 50 people is going to have different challenges than a jail that houses over 1,000. Urban jails such as LA County and Rikers Island have extreme overcrowding, a lot of violence among inmates, sometimes staff-directed violence. But the rural jails, such as the ones that only house up to 50 inmates, have a lack of programming. They a lot of times are extremely understaffed, and many times because of lack of resources and budgetary shortfalls, don't have the right kind of facilities for the population that they have. Keeping also in mind that jails, by their function, have an extremely diverse population. And while we've only talked about two specific types of populations that are typically within their facilities, the pretrial detainees and the misdemeanor convicts, those are not the only offenders that are within this population. We have convicted offenders that are awaiting being sent to federal, state prisons. We're looking at people who have extreme substance abuse or mental illness problems, and we'll talk more about those within the context of our lecture coming up. We have those that have been arrested on warrants from other jurisdictions and are awaiting transfer to those jurisdictions. We have those who have been revoked on their probation or parole, and we've talked about the revocation process in last week's lecture on probation. We've got those juveniles who have been waived from juvenile court and are now within the adult jail population. Witnesses who are in the jails because they have been decided to be put in protective custody or are there for material witness purposes. So we've got a large, diverse population, and each needs to be taken into consideration when they're being looked at for the best possible place in the facility for them to be housed. And that's where we look for booking and classification, an important part of what's going into the initial process when they come in. And that's what we're going to talk about next with the next slide. As I mentioned in the previous slide, being brought to jail by law enforcement is the jumping off point. It's where they're going to start their process through the rest of the criminal justice system. So the booking and classification of the inmate once they get into the local jail facility is extremely important for many, many reasons. Booking is going to be the process of admitting the arrestee or sentenced misdemeanant into the jail. So when they're brought in, number one, the law enforcement personnel is going to have to do a little bit of paperwork when they bring them in. There's going to be a process where they're brought into a sally port or an area that is considered somewhat secure, and they bring the detainee or the arrestee into a lobby area that they can then use to help prepare the arrestee to be brought into the secure part of the jail facility. This is going to require that they take from them part of their property, inventory it, store it, and help with getting some of that into a storage area that the jail personnel will then be able to put away. They have to fill out a charge sheet so that we know what they're being booked on. And then the transfer of custody is made between law enforcement and local corrections. They're brought into the secure part of the jail facility, and then begins the process of booking and classification. Now, what's going to happen at this point is the idea of booking is going to be to properly identify the person that's brought in through a series of biographical and personal questions. And beyond that, they're going to be fingerprinted, photographed, and then they're going to go through a screening process that is going to include medical screening, psychological screening, and then classification screening. And the reason that we do this is to identify how dangerous the person is, the risk of the offenders to themselves, to other people, to staff, and if that means that they should be separated. All in all, we need to figure out if they need things like suicide watch, if they need to be put in a detoxification area, if they need to be placed in a separate housing unit because of the risk that they pose either to others or staff. And so that classification portion is something that is extremely important. On top of that, they might have the opportunity to be released depending on the charge that they brought in on. There is some charges that have a bond automatically placed on them. Others might have to wait until they go through the arraignment process. And then once all of that in the initial booking and classification takes place, if they need to, they will go to a housing unit. So that's kind of how the initial booking and classification process looks like. And once that all happens, they have gone through the first step in their stay at a jail. Looking at what our offender population looks like within our jails today, we're still holding steady at about 750,000 inmates. And while that number hasn't gone up significantly or down significantly over the last several years, what we're looking at is a ratio of about 234 per 100,000 offenders that are in our jails at any given time. Now, while we have seen it stabilize over the years, what does this mean, and why are we still seeing this many people within our nation's jails across the United States? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, but some of them are, and we've talked about this in previous lectures, if you remember talking about some of the reasons for the increase in probation and things like that, also can be attributed to jails. Prisons becoming more overcrowded, the use of local jails to help alleviate that is going to be used. Jail populations are always going to be used to try and reduce or control specific crime problems in the local jurisdictions that are having those problems, such as domestic violence, driving while intoxicated. And so when you see changes in your locality or local jurisdictions regarding a specific crime, then you're going to see an uptick in those people coming into your facilities, just as you will see a decrease in your local jurisdiction jails if you change something that you used to see a high jail arrest rate and then they change it to a civil infraction. For instance, in the Grand Rapids metropolitan area, Grand Rapids Police Department decided rather than arrest people before the marijuana law became legal, rather than arrest people for possession of marijuana, they were just going to give them an appearance ticket. So basically it was, they're not going to arrest them and bring them to jail, they were just going to give them an appearance ticket to go and show up at court. What that allowed for them to do is, number one, it wouldn't tie up what would be a couple of hours for arrest reports, traveling to the jail, and all of that stuff. They would write them a ticket, give it to them, and they could get back out on the street. What that also did was reduce the number of possession of marijuana arrests that came into the jail, where the person would have to be booked in, classified, go in front of the judge, then be released, and all of that stuff. So we saw some changes in our fluctuation of populations. That also will help. So what you have is some fluctuations in local jail populations, but for the most part, jails, depending, will see steady or little declines in their populations over the last several years. So what do our demographics look like? The number of juveniles that we had being waived over and held in adult court saw its peak in the late 90s, and this was as the wave of juvenile crime started to decline. The 90s were a horrible decade for juvenile crime. It was the decade where a lot of legislation was hammering down on juvenile crime, and a lot of juveniles were being waived over to the adult court. What we're now seeing is the influence of the JJDPA, the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, that actually throws money at localities to not waive and confine juveniles in an adult jail. What we've also seen, though, is where we've seen a decline in the juvenile population, we have seen a huge increase in the elderly population. And this can be attributed, and we'll talk about this when we talk about specialized populations in a much later lecture. But that population, the elderly population, has nearly doubled in the last 10 years. And this can be attributed to a lot of different things. Most notably is when you have an elderly population that is starting to suffer from dementia and the problems associated with that, what you have are violent outbursts that can also result in violent crime. You also have those types of inmates that once they get into the jail population bring with them some chronic medical issues, some mental health issues, and that becomes a huge economic challenge to local facilities that are already strapped in their budgets. And so that's something that we have to be aware of. Another part of the jail population that is unique is the genders. Jails typically are going to be called what we know as co-gender facilities, co-correctional, and that they are going to house males and females. And while there is always going to be a significantly higher percentage of males within our jail facilities, what we have seen is that whereas 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the percentage of males within the jail population was upward between 93 to 95%. In 2016, that population of males is now 85%. So we have seen an increase in the female jail population of almost 8%, 8 to 10% over the course of about 20 years. What this also means is you have a new set of problems because females coming into our facilities bring with them their own set of issues and problems. Most notably, healthcare issues are going to be much different than males. Psychological issues are going to be different than males, as females are much more likely to report being sexually abused, physically abused. They're much more likely to be minority and disadvantaged, which means that they're going to require different treatment programs and substance abuse programs and things like that. So those are new considerations that in the last 20 to 25 years have not really been considered. Again, we'll talk about that in a later lecture. When we look at race and ethnicity, we're typically looking at an overrepresentation of minorities within the jail based on their percentage in the community population. So while you look at what their population is within the jail, you'll find that we have more white Caucasian inmates within the jail population than we do any other race or ethnicity. But when you look at it as compared to their percentage within the community population, you're looking at an extreme overrepresentation of minorities within the jails. And last, social class. And this is something that we will continue to talk about in most of our lectures throughout the remainder of the chapters, in that the social class and the effect that being of a lower socioeconomic class is going to adversely affect your ability to function and get the same amount of treatment and the same amount of advantages within our criminal justice system. Most notably, more likely within the jail population, you're not going to be able to make bail. You're going to be more likely to commit very petty offenses, which is going to get you arrested to not make bail. A lot of times you're going to have mental health issues, and you're not going to be able to afford restitution. And if you recall in earlier lectures, that is going to be, especially when we talked about probation, a reason for your probation to be revoked, which then sends you back in front of the judge, which then can have you be sentenced to jail rather than continue on probation. So over the years, jails have typically been considered dumping grounds for the poor, or a catch-all for those in our society that are uneducated, unemployed, homeless, and just poor. And over the years, we've had criminologists who have done research. John Irwin has been probably the most notable, who just called this particular type of disorganized, disenfranchised people rabble, and stated that this is what he feels that the jail has always been invented for, is to operate and manage society's disenfranchised. And this is the reason that jails today, by some, are considered social institutions in which the poor are extremely overrepresented. In reality, our correction system, whether jails or prisons, but mostly jails, are seen as ways to handle the nuisances of our community. And anybody who has looked or worked in a jail, and I worked in a jail for 25 years, the people that were brought in on a consistent, regular basis, those that we called old-timers, were the ones that were homeless, had mental or substance abuse issues, and were brought in on fairly petty, low-level offenses that were arrested because they were causing other people discomfort. Not that they weren't crimes, they were crimes, but because they were considered to be the outliers, the disenfranchised, the marginalized members of society, and they were doing something that was quote-unquote criminal, and they didn't have anywhere else to go, didn't have anywhere else to be or be placed, the jail is the place where they take them. And so it's not unusual to be surrounded by people within the jail that are in need of good mental health programs, good drug treatment programs, alcohol treatment programs. And so we go back to, and we'll talk about in just a little bit, the ability of administration to supply that type of programming and the difficulty and challenge of that, and we'll talk about in just a little bit. So what are some of the things that people need to be aware of if they're going to spend time in jail? Adjustment to working in a jail is going to be dependent on what the climate within the jail is like. That, in and of itself, is going to depend on the communication, the policies, and the climate within the facility that you work in. If you have a climate in which the staff and the inmates have a pretty decent relationship, and I don't mean that it's a Holiday Inn, I don't mean that, they're all buddy-buddy getting along, hug-a-thug, that kind of mentality. What I mean is inmates know the rules, follow them. The staff and inmates basically have a working relationship that is understood. There is communication. There is a kind of a mutual respect, which you can have in a jail setting. Then you're going to find that disruptions and inability to run it efficiently is down. But if you have an environment where policies and communication and the way things are run is extremely negative, then what you're going to have is numerous violations, confrontation, hostage situations, and a lot of it is going to be based on information. Somebody coming into a jail, whether it be for the first time or the 100th time, always are going to have to deal with the uncertainty of what's going to happen during their stay. Whether they're an old pro or a first-time offender, nobody knows. They may try and play it off that they know. Nobody knows what's going to happen going through the court system, going through what they're going to have to deal with, whether they're going to make bail, whether they're going to be able to have bail readjusted at the prelim, whether they're going to be able to get a plea or have to go to trial, whether they're going to lose their family or not be able to see their kids. Or all of this is the uncertainty of their world. And with that comes the stress of having to deal with being in confinement. And whether you agree with it that they chose this, and we go back to those classic criminology arguments, or whatever your belief is, the realization is when we are in a jail atmosphere, the staff and the inmates have to have this copacetic type of relationship where you understand as a staff member you're in charge, and the inmates understand that as an inmate they are the ones being confined, and you find a way to work with it. Now, are there going to be inmates that continually go against that? Yes, that's why we have classification, which we'll talk about more in depth in another lecture. But for the most part, helping them to understand and deal with that uncertain world is part of our job as an officer. And when they're out in their world, they keep themselves busy. It's a not legal busy, but it's a busy. And when they come into our jail, they have nothing to do. So what happens when you have nothing to do? Think about it. What do? Your mind races. You think about all the things that you could have done, should have done, could do, maybe should do, that you know is not right. Well, that's exactly what the inmates are doing. And so we have to understand that when that happens and they're in a confined space where they're told all the time what they can do, what they can't do, when they can do it, how they can do it, and they have somebody all the time watching over them, that's going to build up and can release itself in tension, anxiety, as a result of maybe not having contact with their family or their friends, and this constant pressure. They're going to then start to maybe feel alienated, and they might even start feeling a little bit of guilt. This is part of that adjustment to jail. We can either help with it or we can exacerbate it, and that's going to have an impact on how our jail environment continues on a day-to-day work day. And so that is part of our realization of what inmates do when they're trying to adjust to jail. And so depending on whether you live in a small jail or in a large jail, it really doesn't matter. Inmates have to adjust to their new environment, and we can either understand it and be a part of that adjustment with communication and policy, or we can be adversarial to it. And all it's going to do is make our shift worse and their lives harder. And so that is how we need to adjust our mindset with going in there. And it's still a survival mindset, because at any time they can turn on you. But it's how we go about making sure that everybody, our staff and the inmates, stay alive each and every day. So we talked earlier about the size of jails across the United States. Typically run at a local level by the sheriff, they are going to be elected officials that are answerable and accountable to the voters in their jurisdiction, which is typically a county. Again, if you're Louisiana, it's a parish. And at the county level, we're talking about a very crucial political institution. Now, one of the things that happens when you live in a county and that particular political climate is you get people who are critical and don't understand the operations of a jail and how they should be run. And so you'll find that everybody thinks that they can run the jail better, especially if you're running into a re-election year and there's been issues before in your jurisdiction. They can be critical over how adequate the jail facility is, and that's one thing they don't have control over. Why? For those of you who don't remember from the introduction to corrections, the way that the county gets their money is through property taxes. And so if you don't have enough revenue coming in from property taxes through houses and businesses and other things, that land, you're not going to have the money to run an adequate facility. So when we went through our housing crisis 10 years ago, the counties in the areas went just bonkers because they all of a sudden lost their stream of revenue that funded their budgets. And so a lot of times the criticism about funding for programming and facilities and plant management and staffing and all that stuff comes from something they don't have any control over, because where they get their money is from people who want to live in the area, pay the taxes, and be responsible for the maintenance of a county facility. The other thing is that over the last 30 years or so, we've seen the job of a corrections officer at the local level become much more professionalized. Whereas before, to be a jail guard, a turnkey, whatever you wanted to call it, didn't require a lot of education, training, information. And so what we found over the last 30 years is nationwide that job has started to become much more professionalized through standards that have been set at the American Jail Association level, the National Sheriff's Association level, and the impact of the realization that jail, local corrections officers need and desire and expect the education, knowledge, and training to be able to efficiently, effectively, and adequately run the duty stations of which they are assigned, because of the diversity in the clientele and offenders that they come in contact with every day, shows that as a career, becoming a jail corrections officer is one of those careers that can give you a really good stepping stone and a full career of 25 plus years. And so as an officer sergeant that spent 25 years in local corrections, I have seen the growth, I have seen the realization and the importance of doing this. I've brought that here to LCC and started a local corrections academy here that will allow you to either get a certificate of achievement or to just go through the academy. And it's important that all of the sheriff's departments across the state of Michigan now are starting to look at the local colleges to bring them those students that are looking for a career in local corrections. And so that's where we are heading into the second decade of the 21st century, is this improving professionalism at the local level. And that's what's becoming more important. One thing we have had to work around is the privatization of some of our services. Over the course of the last 10-15 years, and before that, but specifically since we saw the housing crisis of the late 2000s, one way to save money and not have to sacrifice staff, especially uniform staff, was to start the privatization process in some of the areas where we didn't necessarily need county-hired uniform deputy staff in these areas. And so a lot of the counties, a lot of the sheriff's departments and local jail facilities over the course of the last 10 to 20 years have started to privatize their services in the following areas. Medical and mental health care. If you look to your own county, and I know in Kent County, our medical services and our mental health services, we rely on community mental health. For our mental health services, we rely on private medical care through a nationwide corporation. Our food service is through Aramark. Jail work programs, it depends. We run our own work release program, and then we contract out with the different area companies and government agencies to send our workers out there. Community-based inmate programs, we have things like Project Rehab and some other alternative-based programs for inmates. Architectural services, when we were building our new facilities and facility construction, we absolutely use private companies. So these are areas that privatization is going to be able to be a cost saving for counties that are looking to try and find a way to budget their resources, budget their finances, and find a way to keep the importance of security staff, custodial staff at a maximum, and provide the services that they still are required to provide at a private level. And while we've talked about the local types of facilities that we have, and if you recall in an earlier slide, we talked about the local jail, the police lockup, and the workhouse or house of detention, there are three alternatives to local control of jails, of having the county sheriff run the local jail that is available if having a locally run jail is not possible. And the first one is a state-run jail. We have 4 states in the United States that have the states run their jails. And that is Connecticut, Delaware, Rhode Island, and Vermont. And except for 5 jails that are locally operated, Alaska also has a state-operated jail system. The state-run jails typically will offer greater operational efficiency, and there's been a lot of political opposition by the counties to have this local approach, so they allow the states to continue to run their jails. The second type is going to be regional arrangements. And so what you have is a cooperative where there is an adequate jail that's willing to contract with neighboring cities and counties on what we call a per diem basis, which basically is on an as-needed basis. Or you have local government groups that decide that there's no facility around any of their jurisdictions locally, and so they decide to build one big regional jail. So that would be the equivalent of Allegan Berry, or if you wanted to make it more locally, that would be the decision of Ingham, Eaton, Clinton, and maybe Shiawassee, all getting together and deciding that no local government can handle running their own jail. So they're going to build one huge jail that's going to service all 4 counties. And sometimes that happens in a jurisdiction also. The last type is the state subsidized programs. And, excuse me, those will happen when locally operated jails have either political issues, like their politics get in the way, or they just don't have the money. Typically what we find is states will try and provide assistance to local governments when they can. And if that's not possible, then you have a truly locally run jail. But like in the state of Michigan, we do have some state subsidized programs. Sometimes they provide training, or they'll do inspections and stuff like that. And so that's also an option for alternatives to locally administered jails. Okay, so those are some additions and alternatives, but it doesn't mean that it's not locally run. Now the next several slides is going to concentrate on the administration and structure of the types of jails that we have seen over the evolution of the architecture in jails over the last 100 years or so. The first type is going to be what we have considered over the years to be termed a first-generation jail. First-generation jails are going to be linear in design, typical to what we have seen in a Pennsylvania-style architecture, in that it is radial, and it's meant to be intermittent with their checks, where officers are patrolling in catwalks or corridors, and the inmates never leave their cells except for certain types of events. The layout is going to be long rows of rooms, and electronic surveillance is going to compensate for any type of weakness that they see in this linear design, which basically, if you think, the officer is going to be in the middle of this spoke. So there's spokes on a wheel, and the spokes are going to be lines of cells. And so you can see down the hall, but you can't see what's going on in the cells. The idea behind this is to basically just hold the inmates, and the violence among inmates would be against each other. They would destroy the property. The idea was control, not management. And so the idea was, as long as you went around and everything was okay when you went around, you were okay, and you would be reactive to anything that happened. The second generation jail was designed so that you could kind of improve your surveillance, because it would be more remote, as the officer would be in a booth. And it's separated from the inmate living area. The booth would have protective windows, and the use of microphones or speakers would permit any sort of communication that was necessary between the officer and the inmates. The issue with this is you were able to see what the inmates were doing, but you couldn't respond to it. Not quickly. And it still required that staff and inmates be separated. So there still was not really a lot in the way of management. And when it came to trying to discipline the inmates, the minor infractions were let go because it wasn't worth it. They would have to get up and they would have to go into the area and they would have to write it all up. And you weren't really allowed the opportunity to get to know the inmates in your area because you were still sitting behind the glass. And so these two first types of structure and architecture were more about making sure your inmates were controlled. That as long as they were controlled and you reacted afterward, things could be handled and kind of meted out in the process. So let's take a look at the next slide of what the first and second generation architecture looked in a picture. As you can see on the left is what we consider the first generation jail. The black arrow is where the officer would sit and maintain his eye contact down the corridors. But as you can see, with the red arrow, this is where the cells where the inmates would be are located. And so the officers on their checks or their block checks would either walk down the corridor or walk on the outside of those cells, known as catwalks. So again, you would be able to hear but not see what was going on at the time an altercation was going on. Improved a little with the second generation jail on the right, you have with the red arrow where the security station is, where the officer, so the white area around that is going to be a glass where they can see everything. But again, because the glass is separating them from the living areas of the inmates, their response time to anything that would be happening would delay being able to handle those emergency situations, or to be able to get to know the inmates, or be more than observant, not be able to really listen a whole lot, to be able to be proactive in anything that was going on the floor at the time. So these are just a couple of brief diagrams of what the first and second generation jail looks like, and why that would be difficult in being able to effectively work and handle and be proactive in your workstation rather than reactive. In the late 70s, we started to see a change in paradigm where we looked toward an idea of direct supervision jails, also known as a new generation. And this is where the correctional officer station was going to be right within the inmate's living area. This was meant that the officers could see and speak to the inmates, which meant that they could use their observation and listening skills. If you have a direct supervision jail, this generally meant that the inmates were going to be out at all times unless they had permission from the officers to go into their rooms. If they did so, they had to come right back out, or they were in until the next opportunity that the officer wanted to bring them out. Direct supervision allows for a lot of things. Improved communication, effective control and supervision. It also became a way that improved the safety of staff and inmates, allowed for more manageable and cost-effective programs, and supremely improved classification of inmates. It also allowed for staff ownership of the operations. Because if you had a specific area where you were going to be assigned every day, that was your area. You made it operate the way you needed to effectively and efficiently. And so that put the ownership on the staff member working that area to make sure that it ran the way that it needed to be run to the best of their ability. There are some disadvantages to a direct supervision facility. With our current climate of extreme just desserts and retribution, a lot of times direct supervision facilities are seen as mollycoddling to the offenders. There also is a lot of training that's going to be involved in transitioning some staff to this as a new architecture style. And I do remember Kent County went to direct supervision in 1992, and it seems a long, long time ago, but we had been linear intermittent for the previous 100 years. And to go to this new style of paradigm and supervision, every one of our officers had to go through training to understand the type of supervision we were looking at, the communication it was going to take, the ownership, and that at that time was numbering around 175 to 200 officers that had to go through this training. That's a large price tag for a brand new facility. And if you have overcrowding, implementing this style is going to be hard. And we found that we had to make arrangements for double bunking, which can severely hamper your operations expectations. And so there are some downsides to direct supervision, but all in all, going from linear intermittent to direct supervision is a better way to manage your inmate population. The latest to enter into the architectural style of inmate jails is what we call the fourth generation jail. And this is considered the OmniView Total Supervision. It's a fourth generation jail, and it encompasses a centrally placed high-strength mirror glass control with a panoramic view that gives the officers 100% surveillance of the entire inmate over the facility. It is a complete interior of the cell units, rec area, stairwells, entryway, multipurpose rooms. All of it is totally visible. And it eliminates what is known as facility blind spots. One of the reasons that this has been instituted is to be in compliance with the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which is a law that we will talk about in more detail in a future lecture. But the design of this particular jail can be utilized in single, double, or multiple occupancy cells to make sure that you don't have any blind spots, and in the end has increased operational cost savings for any of your classification needs. So in the next slide, we're going to look at the difference between the new and fourth generation jails. In the upper picture is the one possible layout of a direct supervision jail. The black arrow signifies where the officer would be, where his desk would be, and the ability for him to see all around him and to observe as well as listen to the inmates that are out in the day room, and to go around on his checks to make sure that those that have decided to stay in the room are okay and not in any distress. The bottom picture is the new OmniView Total Supervision. Red arrow is designating the high up area where the officer is, that is surrounded by high level windows, that is able to see into all of the inmate occupied living areas, and that allows for no blind spots for total supervision. And as we move into the 21st century with the need for less intermittent and more management supervision, you'll see that as new construction starts, there will become a more reliance on direct or omni supervision as we move forward. The realization is that the ability for jails to have programs within their facilities is going to be dependent on the size of the jail, the budget of the jail, and the ability to have the resources. The smaller the jail, the likelihood that the ability to provide programs will decrease with the size of the jail. If they do have programming within the jails at the small jail level, it will be because volunteers have come forward to be able to provide some of those resources. Large jails will tend to have more programs, but again, the overcrowding in these large jails is going to make that even difficult because each inmate is not going to be able to receive programming. When we look at some of the jails and what it is that they offer, most of the jails across the United States will provide work release programs, which means that they have a designated area where the judge can sentence them to maintain employment during their sentence, and they come to this particular facility when they are off shift to be in a minimum security locked facility. There are a high percentage of jails that will also have GED or adult basic education, which will allow inmates to continue working on the equivalency of a high school diploma or reading literacy and things like that. And you will find that most jails, if possible, even relying on volunteers, will have drug or alcohol treatment programs. So you will find Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. There also might be some court-mandated programs that are run through local jails. Counseling is going to be dependent on availability of resources. You might have mental health counseling through your local community mental health, but it might only be designated during specific times of the day. Religious services is also on a volunteer basis, depending on availability of your faith-based organizations in your area, as is exercise and the availability of equipment and space in the facility that you have. Law library, we will, as we talked about in the, or we'll talk about in the chapter on legal rights, is something that is constitutionally required. And so most jails have at least some books or access to legal information within their facilities. So those are just some of the programming that is available and that, dependent on facility resources, budgets, and staffing, can be made available to the inmates within facilities. When it comes to the type of health problems that jails deal with, because we have such a diverse population and we deal with what is considered by John Irwin to be rabble, but those that are considered to be the poor, the maladapted, the misfortunate, the lower social class, those that are going to be the riskier behaved on the streets, those that have the outliers. They're also going to be coming into our facility at those points in their lives where they are in need of the most help. And so these healthcare issues are the ones that we're going to see more than maybe in the prison population at the very start. So when we talk communicable diseases, we're talking about things like bloodborne airborne pathogens, such as hepatitis, HIV, tuberculosis, and other types of easily transmittable diseases that, because of the close confines of the facility, as well as their poor immune systems based on their lifestyles, are easily transmittable within our facilities. We're also talking about chronic diseases, people that have come in with long-standing medical issues such as high blood pressure, diabetes, epilepsy, heart disease, those types of issues. They will continue to come in and have to be treated within our facilities. Substance abuse and mental health, sometimes they will come in with one or the other or both. And so, again, something that we have to be aware of and take care of for the females coming into our facilities. If they come in pregnant, most of them, because of their riskier lifestyles, will be considered high risk because they will have not had any prenatal care prior to coming into our facilities. And therefore, we need to get them up to speed onto prenatal vitamins, maybe some extra nutrition to make sure that their baby is going to thrive. And then in the 21st century, many of our facilities, jail facilities, are non-smoking now. And so if they come in and they are smoking, number one, you got to make sure that they don't come in with any, so you're checking for contraband. And then secondly, you need to help them through the quitting smoking process, which can be very difficult. So these are some of the crucial healthcare issues that we constantly work with with inmates who are coming into our facilities because of who they are, where they come from, and the behaviors that they have engaged in prior to their being arrested and coming into our facilities. I want to take a moment now and talk about the officers that staff our jails across the United States today. Numbering over 200,000, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, we are now considered to be a profession that requires education, training, and skill. This has become something of importance because of the change in paradigm in the last 30 years from linear intermittent architectural designs to the design and institution of the new generation and omni-generation architecture of the jails. We've also seen an extreme movement toward professionalism where we have worked toward changing the way jail officers are looked at. Typically, if 40, 50 years ago, if somebody applied for a job, all they needed to know was if you had more brawn than brains. If you could keep yourself good in a fight, and if you could handle yourself in any sort of altercation, if you had your partner's back. It was also that the jail was looked upon as a stepping stone to the road patrol. And all you had to do was bide your time and you could go out and be a law enforcement officer. And that if you got in trouble on the road, well, then your punishment was going back into the jail. And it's been within the last 30 years that there's been a divergence where now we understand that you need a specific skill set for both professions. That it's not necessarily one is worse than the other, but that they both require professionalism, intellect, knowledge, and skill to be able to perform these jobs in the highest professional levels. Females who work in our jails comprise about 1/3 of all the employees that work within the jails. But one thing that we're still having difficulty in the diverse population of our staff is with minorities. And this is something that we all continue to struggle with, in that we need to understand where our inmate population is and be able to serve them better with as culturally diverse of a staff. We've also worked to improve the education of our officers with correctional academies in the knowledge that they are given to be able to handle the inmate population with communication, inmate conflict, and how to handle the day-to-day duties within the inmate and workplace of our jails nationwide. One of the most important things anybody coming into this profession will learn is how to handle those inmates that are mentally ill, have substance abuse issues, but also how to write reports. The most important thing anybody considering a role in local corrections needs to understand is you are in no way going to be considered a reject of law enforcement. You have the capacity for a promising career in local jail corrections, and we here at LCC want you to consider a career in local corrections. The population of the jail and its offenders constantly change, and officers are taught how to be adaptive to that particular ever-changing offender population. Officers need to be able to respond in a professional manner, and you will be taught to do so. The dependence on your pay is going to be whether you are in a small jail jurisdiction or a large jail jurisdiction. It's also going to be dependent geographically, but the pay has gotten better, benefits have gotten better, and you will find that working locally, you now are treated on the same plane as law enforcement officers nationwide. So what are some of the issues of having a large population, or any population, confined in your jail? One of the biggest things is jail crowding. Over the years, it's gotten progressively worse, and we see overcrowding being a particular problem within large urban jails such as Cook County, Los Angeles County, DC, and larger cities as those. Especially true is those states such as California, who have had to depopulate their state prisons, as we've talked about in the last lecture on probation, and have had to send some of their inmates into the local county jails to reduce the state prison population. Also a problem at the jail level is what we call idleness, inmate idleness. We talked about the idea of boredom being an issue in adjusting to jail. If you give the inmates nothing to do, believe me, they will find something to do. And typically, if left to their own devices, it's not good. And so, trying to find and give them something to do other than sit there and do nothing is something that needs to be looked upon by jail administrators across the United States to alleviate some of the inmate idleness. If not, you will end up with tension among the inmates and among inmates and staff, which will result in violence, which then can contribute to a decrease in health in both the staff and the inmates. Another thing that we need to take into consideration when it comes to jail confinement is the mental health of the inmates, because we're seeing a huge increase in those that have mental illnesses coming into our facilities. Jails across the United States, along with prisons, are the de facto mental hospitals across the United States. Mental illnesses among inmates has quadrupled in recent years, and more than half of all prison and jail inmates report mental health problems. Jail inmates who have had mental health problems were 3 times as likely as jail inmates without that reported that they have been somehow physically or sexually abused in the past. If we look at the fact that short incarceration lengths tend to limit the ability for them to get opportunities for treatment, then we need to look at the possibility of how quickly we can look at this as providing solutions for those with mental health issues. Oftentimes, placing them in psychiatric facilities is not an opportunity, or it's not an option, because those psychiatric facilities in your community are not really willing to take on inmates who are showing violent tendencies or are looking at involuntary commitment. So what are the things that we are going to be looking at as we move forward in the 21st century? Some of the things we're going to be looking at are improving minimum standards for the construction and operation of jails, looking to improving and changing those that are still considered linear intermittent, to bringing them up to things like at least direct, if not omni. We've also seen that in recent years, more states have gone to establishing procedures for state inspections. Michigan is one of those that has consistently been reliant upon the Michigan Department of Corrections to provide inspections to make sure that their procedures and policies are up to standards. We're also looking at the possibilities of regional jails becoming more of a part of the local correctional landscape, as well as seeing more privatization within the American landscape, local landscape, not just in the use of services, but also as a jail operational system. We're also taking a look at how to improve the quality of life of the jail inmates, which means bringing a concerted effort into treatment programming at the jail level, such as community service, work release, weekend release, as well as having things like day reporting centers, which are things we'll talk about in future lectures. As we move into the 21st century, there is always room for improvement at our local jail level. And therefore, we're always looking to improve how things are working now. We'll see new technologies, improvements on what supervision is already being done, as well as new construction designs to make sure that we are not only supplying the best supervision for our inmates, but the best safety for our staff. We will continue to professionalize this career for our local corrections officers, as well as figure out new ways to make sure that the offender that we serve is adjusting and being given the opportunity to get treatment while he has his stay, however short, within the local jail.